The mahogany doors of Courtroom 7 billion burst open with a thunderous bang. Sarah Chen, her dark hair falling loose from its careful braid, stood in the doorway breathing heavily. Her school uniform was rumpled, and her backpack hung precariously from one shoulder. "Stop. He's lying," the words exploded from her 15-year-old throat, echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. "My stepfather is lying about everything." Judge Martinez's gavel cracked against the sound block. "Young lady, this is a closed custody hearing. You cannot." "Please, Your Honor," Sarah's voice cracked. "You need to hear what I found. 8 hours earlier." The kitchen clock read 7:15 a.m. as Sarah pushed her scrambled eggs around her plate. Morning sunlight streamed through the bay windows of their suburban home, highlighting the tension that stretched across the breakfast table like a rubber band about to snap. "Sarah, honey, eat your breakfast." Helen Chen's voice was tight as she stirred her coffee for the 100th time. "You need your energy for that math test today." "I'm not hungry." Sarah's eyes flicked to Richard Thompson, her stepfather of 2 years, who sat hidden behind his tablet, his expensive watch glinting as he scrolled through emails. His presence felt like a shadow over their once warm morning routine. "Your mother made you breakfast." Richard lowered his tablet, his steel-grey eyes fixing on her with that look, the one that seemed kind on the surface but held something cold underneath. "It would be respectful to eat it." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. "Like you respect Dad's right to see me." Helen's coffee cup hit the saucer with a sharp clink. "We've discussed this. The new custody arrangement is what's best for everyone." "Best for Richard, you mean?" Sarah pushed back from the table, chair legs scraping against hardwood. "Dad would never." "Your father," Richard interrupted smoothly, "has demonstrated that he's not currently capable of providing a stable environment. That's what today's hearing is about." Sarah's chest tightened as she thought of her dad, David Chen, alone in his small apartment. The same apartment Richard's company had mysteriously bought out from under him 6 months ago, forcing him to move from the building he'd lived in for a decade. The same dad who'd never missed a single one of her soccer games until Richard started scheduling family commitments that somehow always conflicted. "I have to get to school." Sarah grabbed her backpack, her hand brushing against the USB drive hidden in the front pocket. Her heart hammered. Soon, everyone would know the truth. Helen's voice followed her to the door. "Remember, Richard's picking you up at 3 for your dentist appointment." Sarah's hand tightened on the doorknob. "Yeah," she said quietly. 3 o'clock. She had 6 hours to set things right. Sarah used to love Sunday mornings. The smell of her dad's slightly burnt pancakes would drift upstairs, mixing with her mum's laughter as she tried to salvage breakfast. Back then, their 3-bedroom colonial in Cedar Grove felt like the center of her universe. Dad's engineering books cluttered the coffee table, Mum's art supplies brightened every corner, and Sarah's soccer trophies lined the mantel, a perfect chaos that spelled home. That was before the argument started, before the whispered conversations behind closed doors, before her mum started taking evening art classes at the community center where she met Richard Thompson. Richard, the successful property developer, the charming widower, the man who swept into their lives like a perfectly tailored hurricane. "He just gets me," Helen had gushed to her sister on the phone, while Sarah pretended to do homework at the kitchen counter. "It's like he knows exactly what I've been missing." The courtship was swift. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates. Dinner dates turned into weekend trips. Sarah watched her mother transform designer clothes, replaced paint-stained jeans, carefully styled hair replaced messy buns, and scheduled social events replaced spontaneous family movie nights. David Chen tried to keep up. He traded engineering journals for parenting books, scheduled marriage counseling sessions, even started taking cooking classes. But it was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. "Your mother needs space to find herself," Richard had told Sarah over dinner at Le Blanc, his favorite 5-star restaurant. She was 13 then, drowning in a dress he'd bought her, picking at food she couldn't pronounce. Sometimes love means letting go. The divorce papers arrived 3 months later. Sarah noticed the patterns slowly, like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. How Richard's suggestions always seemed to become her mother's decisions. How family emergencies at his company mysteriously coincided with her dad's planned visits. How Helen's art supplies gathered dust in the garage while Richard's business associates filled their new home's dinner parties. "It's just growing pains," sweetie Helen would say, distracted by another charity gala planning meeting. "Richard's helping us build a better life." But Sarah saw how her dad's shoulders slumped lower with each rescheduled weekend. How he'd sit in his car outside her soccer games because Richard had already claimed the parent spot in the bleachers. How his voice would catch when she mentioned her mum's new life. "I'm still here," kiddo David would say during their brief phone calls, his voice fighting to stay steady. "Nothing will change that." But things did change. The custody agreement Richard's lawyers drafted left David with alternate weekends and Wednesday dinners. Then Richard's company bought Dad's apartment building. Then came the job offer that required Helen and Sarah to be available for frequent family travel, making David's scheduled visits impractical. Sarah watched her mother drift away, replaced by a polished stranger who spoke in careful sentences and checked her phone constantly for Richard's messages. Gone were the impromptu dancing sessions in the kitchen, the late-night ice cream conspiracies, the shared giggles over bad reality TV. "Your mother's finally becoming who she was meant to be," Richard would say, his hand possessive on Helen's shoulder. "We all need to support her journey." But Sarah saw the shadows under her mother's eyes, noticed how she'd flinch slightly when Richard's tone sharpened, watched her smile fade the moment she thought no one was looking. It was like watching someone slowly disappear while standing right in front of you. The final straw came when Sarah found her mother crying in the garden, clutching one of her old paintbrushes. Mum, Sarah had whispered. Helen quickly wiped her eyes. "Oh, honey, I was just. Richard thinks I should focus on the charity foundation instead of art classes. He's right, of course. It's more appropriate for someone in our position." That night, Sarah started digging through Richard's home office. She knew there had to be proof of what she'd felt all along: the manipulation, the lies, the careful dismantling of their family. She just never expected to find quite so much of it. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the USB drive under her desk lamp. 3 nights of sneaking into Richard's home office had yielded a treasure trove of damning evidence, all meticulously copied and stored in this tiny device. The first discovery came by accident. A misfiled folder labeled Chen Property Holdings caught her eye while she was searching for a stapler. Inside, she found documentation of how Richard's company had systematically purchased properties around her father's apartment building, driving up costs until the owner had no choice but to sell. "Maya, I need your help," Sarah whispered during lunch break, pulling her best friend behind the gymnasium. Maya Rodriguez, whose mother worked as a paralegal, had always been the practical one in their friendship. "This is serious stuff." Sarah Maya pushed her glasses up her nose as she scrolled through the documents on her laptop. "Look at these shell companies. They all trace back to Richard's firm." But late one evening, while pretending to do homework in the study adjacent to Richard's office, Sarah overheard a phone conversation that made her blood run cold. "David, Chen won't be a problem much longer," Richard's voice oozed confidence. "Once we push through this custody modification, Helen will have full control. The property acquisition can proceed as planned, yes. The judge has been properly motivated to see things our way." Sarah's pencil snapped in her grip. The investigation deepened. Maya's mother's legal knowledge proved invaluable as they pieced together Richard's scheme. He hadn't just targeted David's apartment, he'd been systematically forcing out small property owners across the city, using insider information and questionable tactics. "See these signatures?" Maya pointed to a series of documents. "The notary dates don't match the filing dates. And look at the witness names, they're all employees of Richard's shell companies." Sarah's first attempt to tell her mother ended in disaster. She caught Helen alone in the kitchen one evening, armed with preliminary evidence. "Mom, I need to show you something about Richard." "Not now." Honey Helen barely looked up from her phone. "Richard's investors are coming for dinner, and I need to review the seating arrangement he prepared." The second attempt came after Sarah found emails proving Richard had bribed city officials to change zoning laws, directly impacting her father's property value. "Mum, please, this is important." Sarah Helen's voice carried a warning edge. "Richard says you've been snooping around his office. That needs to stop. He's done everything to make us comfortable, and this is how you repay him." The final straw came when Sarah discovered a draft custody agreement on Richard's laptop. It outlined a plan to terminate David's parental rights entirely, citing his unstable living situation and interference with the child's new family structure. That night, Sarah heard her mother crying again, this time in the master bathroom. She knocked softly. "Go away, Sarah." Helen's voice was muffled. "Richard's right. I need to be stronger about setting boundaries." Sarah retreated to her room, clutching the USB drive. The custody hearing was tomorrow. Richard had arranged for her to be at a dentist appointment, an appointment she now knew didn't exist. He'd planned everything perfectly, ensuring she couldn't testify. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Dad's courier friend can get you into the courthouse. You sure about this?" Sarah looked at the family photo on her nightstand, her mum and dad at her middle school graduation, before Richard entered their lives. She thought of her mother's fading smile, her father's desperate eyes, the weight of truth heavy in her hands. "I'm sure," she texted back. "Tomorrow morning. Everything changes. Your Honor, I only want what's best for Sarah." Richard Thompson's voice carried the perfect note of concern as he addressed Judge Martinez. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled. "Ever since I married Helen, I've tried to provide the stable environment Sarah needs." But from his seat at the respondent's table, David Chen's hands clenched into fists. His navy suit, his only suit, seemed shabby in comparison to Richard's tailored elegance. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Martinez consulted her notes. "You're requesting full custody be transferred to Mrs. Thompson with supervised visitation for Mr. Chen." "Regrettably, yes." Richard's sigh seemed practiced. "David's recent housing difficulties have created an unsuitable environment for a teenage girl, and his increasingly erratic behavior, showing up unannounced at Sarah's school, sending inappropriate texts at all hours, concerns you as deeply." David surged to his feet. "That's not true. I only went to her soccer game, the one I was uninvited from, after driving an hour to get there." "Mr. Chen," Judge Martinez warned, "you'll have your turn." Helen sat in the gallery, twisting her wedding ring. Her designer dress couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted between her ex-husband and her new one. When David finally took the stand, his voice shook with emotion. "Sarah is my world, Your Honor. Yes, I had to move to a smaller apartment. Yes, I've had to change jobs. But every decision I've made has been to stay close to my daughter." He pulled out a worn photo from his wallet. "This is from her first soccer goal. I taught her to play in our backyard. I've never missed a game." Until his voice cracked. "Until recently." Helen's sharp intake of breath echoed in the quiet courtroom. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Martinez called Helen to testify. "Do you support your husband's petition for full custody?" Helen stood, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the witness stand. Richard thinks it's best. Sarah needs structure, and David's situation is complicated. And these complications arose after your marriage to Mr. Thompson." "Objection, Your Honor." Richard's lawyer interrupted smoothly, irrelevant to the current petition. Outside the courtroom, Sarah pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding. Maya's father's courier badge had gotten her into the building, but the bailiff blocked her entry. Through the heavy wood, she heard Richard's voice rise again. "We can provide Sarah with private school education, summer programs abroad, connections for college." His words slithered through the gap beneath the door. "Meanwhile, Mr. Chen can barely maintain rent payments." Sarah clutched the USB drive, her mind racing. The evidence was clear. Richard had orchestrated her father's financial ruin, manipulated her mother through subtle emotional abuse, and now planned to cut her father out completely. "Your Honor." David's voice cracked again. "I may not have much, but I have love for my daughter. That's worth something, isn't it?" The judge's response was drowned out by the blood rushing in Sarah's ears. Through the door's window, she saw Richard smirking slightly, saw her mother's shoulders slump, saw her father's defeat. Her hand touched the door handle. Everything she'd discovered, all the evidence on the USB drive, it could change everything. But it would also shatter her mother's world, expose corruption that could destroy careers, and tear apart what remained of their family's privacy. Richard's voice drifted through again. "We ask the court to consider what's truly best for Sarah." Sarah's grip tightened on the handle. What was truly best? The truth, with all its messy consequences, or silence, letting Richard's perfectly constructed lies stand? The bailiff stepped toward her. "Miss, you can't be here." Sarah made her decision. She pushed open the doors. "Stop. He's lying." Sarah's voice cut through the courtroom like a thunderbolt. "I have proof." Richard's composed facade cracked for a split second before he recovered. "Sarah, sweetheart, you should be at your appointment." "There is no appointment." Sarah strode forward, USB drive extended. Just like there was no legitimate reason for Dad's apartment building to be sold, was there, Richard? Judge Martinez's gavel cracked. "Young lady." "Your Honor, please." Sarah's voice trembled but held firm. "Richard Thompson orchestrated my father's financial ruin. I have the documents, emails, and recorded conversations to prove it." Helen stood, face pale. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" "Show me," Judge Martinez ordered, motioning for the bailiff to take the USB drive. As the documents projected onto the courtroom screen, Richard's carefully constructed world began to unravel. Email trails revealed systematic property manipulation. Bank statements showed suspicious transfers. Recorded conversations exposed judicial bribes. "That's inadmissible." Richard's lawyer jumped up. "Those documents were obtained illegally." "They were obtained from our home computer," Sarah countered, "where Richard kept details of how he bribed city officials, forced out small property owners, and," she looked at her mother, "manipulated our entire family." Richard's mask finally shattered. "You little," he lurched forward, but the bailiff moved faster. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Martinez's voice cut like ice, "sit down. Ms. Chen, continue." Helen stared at the financial documents, recognition dawning. "The Art Foundation money, you said it was temporarily relocated for tax purposes." "He's been stealing from you," Mum Sarah said softly. "From your foundation, from Dad's pension fund, from everyone." The courtroom erupted as Richard's lawyer desperately called for order. Helen collapsed into tears, and David rushed to Sarah's side. Above the chaos, Judge Martinez's gavel cracked repeatedly. "This hearing is suspended," she announced. "Bailiff, detain Mr. Thompson. I'm referring these documents to the district attorney's office immediately." As Richard was led away, his perfect hair disheveled, he snarled, "You have no idea what you've done." But Sarah knew exactly what she'd done. She'd chosen truth over comfort, courage over silence. As her mother embraced her, sobbing apologies, and her father stood protectively nearby, Sarah felt the weight of secrets finally lift from her shoulders. Judge Martinez peered down at her. "Young lady, while I don't condone your methods, you've done the right thing today." The three of them sat in their old living room, Helen, David, and Sarah, surrounded by the echoes of what used to be. Helen's hands shook as she sorted through the evidence Sarah had gathered. "I was so blind," Helen whispered, tears falling onto the documents. "The signs were all there. The way he isolated me, controlled everything. I just thought he was being protective." David leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Helen, he manipulated all of us." "But I let him." Helen's voice cracked. "I let him push you away, David. I let him change me." And Sarah, she looked at their daughter with aching regret. "I almost let him take away your father." Sarah sat between them, feeling the weight of both triumph and loss. "I had to do something, Mom. When I found those documents." "You were so brave." Helen reached for her daughter's hand. "Braver than I was." Outside, reporters gathered on their lawn. Richard's arrest had made headlines. Prominent developer exposed for fraud, bribery, and manipulation. His empire was crumbling, taking down corrupt officials and business partners with it. "The DA says they've been trying to build a case against him for years," David explained. "They just never had enough evidence." Helen stood suddenly, moving to the mantel where Richard had insisted on displaying their perfect family photos. With trembling hands, she turned them face down. "I want to be me again," she declared softly. "The real me. The one who painted, who laughed, who wasn't afraid." Sarah watched her parents, her real parents, share a look of understanding. There was pain there, and history, but also something else. Possibility. "We'll figure it out," Sarah said, feeling both older and younger somehow. Together. Outside, the media circus continued. Inside, three people began the delicate work of rebuilding what had been broken, stronger for having been tested, wiser for having been fooled, and more grateful for having almost lost each other. 3 months later, Sarah sat in the garden watching her mother paint. Helen's easel was set up under the old maple tree, her brush strokes confident again as she captured the autumn colors. The custody agreement sat signed on the kitchen table inside. Joint custody, equal time, no restrictions. "Your roses are coming in nicely," David observed, joining them with 3 mugs of hot chocolate. He'd moved back to the neighborhood last week, his old apartment building restored to its original owners after Richard's conviction. Sarah helped me plant them, Helen smiled, adding a splash of red to her canvas. She has her father's green thumb. The garden had become their healing ground. Here, mother and daughter had spent countless hours talking, crying, and slowly rebuilding trust. Here, they'd learned to be honest about their feelings, their fears, and their hopes. "I got an A on my essay," Sarah announced. "The one about standing up for truth." Helen put down her brush. "You taught us all about that, sweetheart." "You taught us about courage," David added. Sarah looked between them, these 2 people who'd found their way back to being parents together, if not partners. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't fighting for what you wanted, but accepting what you needed. "We all taught each other," she said softly, understanding now that truth, like love, was something you had to choose every day.